Okay, this is a continuation of the population explanation. I gave you the chart, my supposed chart of how they could have advanced in the population to over 2 million. And this was feasible. We're at this site right here. Take a look at that. And we're at the number at the bottom of the chart of 2,350,056. That's just a chart that shows the feasibility of over 2 million, which is 350,000 more than 2 million. Now let's see the biblical explanation of that. See if they fit. As the time of God's promise of Israel's 400 years of affliction in a foreign land was drawing near to its end. That's somewhere around 200 years in Egypt and 200 years in Canaan. The population of Israel had multiplied to a great number. This was in the time of another king of Egypt, who had not known Joseph. Because before that, the Israelites flourished. Their population grew, their flocks. They occupied the area outside of where the Egyptians occupied, but they were not enslaved. This king dealt treacherously with the people of Israel with ever-increasing oppression and infanticide. So we look at that in Acts chapter 7, and according to Stephen says, as the time of promise was drawing nigh, which God did swear to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, till another king rose who had not known Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with other people and oppressed our forefathers, making them cast out their babies so that they might not live. Note the Lord's promise to Abram that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land and be in a bondage for 400 years. But after that, they would come out of the land and serve the Lord in the promised land, to which Stephen referred to in Acts 7, 6-7. Stephen was martyred after giving the speech, even though it was historically very accurate. This included Israel coming out with great possessions. Genesis 15:14 quoted above, Acts 7:16. Okay. Whereupon Stephen testified to the Sanhedrin court that the prosperity of Israel in Egypt continued till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them cast out their babies so that they may not live. Hence many were killed and being cast into the Nile River. We have this in Exodus. The statement implies that the new king was not closely connected with the previous Pharaoh, for Joseph's accomplishments in Egypt were legendary. This evidently implies that the rulers of Egypt were most likely not Egyptian. Hence the new king was most likely one of the Hyksos kings who descended from Semitic foreign invaders. They did not use Egyptian hieroglyphic writings on their scarabs. They were like the Israelites. They were Semites. They ruled over Egypt for a time, 1730 to 1570 BC, and would not know of Joseph being a Jew that died earlier. The Hyksos kings controlled Egypt by a military force which was much smaller in numbers than the native population, including the Hebrews, causing Pharaoh's hostility toward the growing population of the Hebrews, stipulated in the next two verses, a perceived threat to his rulership. So we have that in Psalm 78, 12-13. Note that Zoan is the famous Egyptian city of Tanis built by the Hyksos about 1700 BC, which indicates that a Hyksos king was a ruler of Egypt at the time of Moses and the Exodus. So he says, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mighty than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they would also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. So, Pharaoh was motivated in preserving his own power as well as in Israel's brick population and building program. He was most likely one of the Hyksos kings who ruled over Egypt via a military occupation force that was not as large as the native population of Egypt or Israel's. Hence, he was paranoid about the rapidly growing Hebrew population joining forces in an uprising or invasion force. The word afflict in verse 11 implies forced labor for the Israelites in the Nile River Delta, where Pithom and Ramses was located. were located. This cruel and deadly oppression of a people was, as is common all over the ancient and present-day world, in order to reduce them as a threat to the ruling powers, especially a large group of people. On the other hand, the people were a valuable resource as forced labor to build fortifications and supply cities, such as Pithom and Ramses. And they were afflicted, Israel, but they multiplied and grew nevertheless. The Egyptians made Israel serve with rigor, sense of being harsh toward them. The greater the affliction, the more the Israelite population increased, which in turn caused the rulers to dread the Israelites turning against them in battle, causing even greater and more oppression. In fact, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name was Shiphrah, was one of the names, and the name of the other was Puah. So the king was probably not one of the Hyksos kings who descended from foreign invaders of Egypt over the time, but Thutmose, who continued the abusive enslavement of the Israelites of his predecessors. So it's later on. This new Pharaoh, although native Egyptian, was just as disturbed by the rapid population growth of the Hebrew colony as the Hyksos rulers were, hence they persecuted them even more. One led to the other, especially in light of having been oppressed themselves by the Hyksos, the foreigners, and finally were able to oust them. Furthermore, Egyptians had been increasingly hostile toward the Hebrews since they arrived in Egypt in Joseph's times, centuries earlier, largely due to their religious and cultural differences. That's why they lived outside of their cultural area of Egyptians. The Hebrews, so far as they were concerned, were despicable blasphemers of their gods. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. So the Egyptian king now resorted to infanticide by attempting to get the Israelite midwives to murder newborn males. And the two women named Shiphrah and Puah, Semitic and not Egyptian names, were evidently the administrators of all the midwives of Israel. The context implies that the midwives were largely, if not all, Jewish, for they are described as fearing the God of Israel. But when they all refused to kill the newborn male babies, Pharaoh intimated in verse 22 that he would use his own people, Egyptians, to carry out the infanticide of Israelite newborn male babies. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children and kept them alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and saved the male children? The midwife said, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, but they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. There's the sovereignty of God involved in this. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. Okay. So the population increased. No punishment was forthcoming from the king. God evidently protected and dealt well with the midwives, providing households for them, an extraordinary thing for the women in those times, implying that they were blessed with the children as well, children of Israel. And so Pharaoh commanded of his people, you throw the babies in the river of the Hebrews. All right. So the plot thickens. And at the same time, Moses is born. You know the history of Moses? He was brought up to his father's house for 3 months, and then finding him exposed out on the Nile by Moses' mother's design and the providence of God, the daughter of Pharaoh found him, took him in and reared him, and he became a son of the Pharaoh and a potential ruler. And there's the history of how Moses was exiled. So this is the history Stephen is giving. So there is the sovereignty of God involved, and the longevity and the number of Israelite babies born in those days. So I think we're pretty much on the answer of Israel crossing the Red Sea at that ideal location, and that their population was great.